Hi, I'm Tinny from Design, and today I'm going to take the day off from prototyping, and I'm going to talk about stove design, answer some questions that some people have been asking me, and just generally have a good time. Now, this morning I went out and finished up 5 Moodus, and that brings up a point. I'm going to rename the Moodu. I'm going to rename it the M6. So for the meantime, it'll be the Moodu M6, but eventually it'll just be the M6. Now, Beth wanted to know what to put in with directions when you sell an M6 or a Moodu, and I told her to put a set of M2 directions in with it because the M6, the Moodu, has an M2 top on it, and those would be the pertinent directions. The rest of it's pretty much self-explanatory. And if you're not confused now, I can talk some more. But anyway. Okay, somebody asked me to explain the difference and the application for the micro line versus the large silicone line. Okay, originally they all had the large silicone line, which was pretty tough, pretty hard to burn through it if you overflowed the stove, and it's pretty tough stuff. So a little bit heavy. It was a little bit, I think the reason why I got away from it was so stiff that when you'd move the bottle it would actually push these little tiny stoves around. So I went to the micro line, which is nowhere near as tough, but still tougher than need be. And there's 2 advantages to that. One is when you move the bottle around, it doesn't move the stove because it's much more flexible. And 2, the part I really like is when you go to fuel up the stove, this hole in the middle is small enough so that it fuels rather slow. With the large fuel line, if you gave a big squirt on the bottle, you could easily overwhelm the stove and flood it very easily. With a micro line, you've got to hold it there a little while. It's much slower. So you could use either one. It's just that the micro line is a little slower and much more flexible, and it's lighter. So that was a logical stuff to go to, and that's basically what I use on all my stoves now. Now, the only place where I would say the heavier line is a better idea is if you're going to use an SS remote. It'll work fine with a micro line, but it works better with the large line. But I'd probably still go with a micro line because it's just nice stuff and it doesn't move the stove around. So that's basically the only difference between the micro line and the large line. Okay, now let's talk silicone. People have asked me this. Okay, why is there a piece of silicone in the center of this stove? Well, there's actually 3 or 4 different reasons. Let me just give you a few. First is, if you're going to make these modular so that you can put different tops on them, you have to be able to attach them and unattach them. The most logical and easy way for me would just go to silicone. Snaps on, either way, it's rugged, strong, take good grip. That's one reason. So if I want to go from an M2 top to an M5 top, I just pop it off, pop the M5 top on. They're very modular. Okay, second reason, and probably as important as the first one is, when you burn this stove, this carbon felt wick is running at 1400 degrees. So a lot of the heat from that, although it's burning up and there's liquid alcohol, it still imparts a fair amount of heat to this ring. Now, because this is silicone and it's a non-conductive surface, in other words, it's a thermal block, it carries very little heat. As this gets hot, it doesn't transfer the heat to the base where all the alcohol is setting. And that's a good thing because you don't want the alcohol to boil in the base. If this was one of the stoves like a soda can stove, which works on a thermal loop, you light it and the flame heats the stove, which boils the alcohol, which feeds the flame, which heats the stove, which boils the alcohol. You've got a thermal loop. These stoves don't work on a thermal loop, so you don't want the alcohol to boil in the bottom. Yeah. You don't want the alcohol to boil in the bottom of the stove, because if it starts to boil, it'll expand and it'll run away with itself. You don't want to do that. You want the alcohol on the bottom to stay a liquid and let the carbon felt's capillary action pull it up into the top where the flame is, And the carbon felt not only does it have a good capillary action to pull the alcohol up, it also tends to spread it out and gasify it when it gets out into all these fibers and spread it out so it's not just in a puddle. So it burns much more efficiently. That's the reason why it burns blue. So that's another reason why the silicone is in there. It's a thermal block to keep the alcohol cool. Now, if you didn't have the silicone in there, you would have to come up with another way to hook the bottom to the top. Now, if you wanted it so you were never going to take it apart, you could make it all one piece, I guess. But if you wanted it modular so you could take it apart and do things with it, it would have to be able to attach it and unattach it. And I come up really short on ways to do that aren't complicated. How would you hook the bottom to the top if you weren't using a silicone sleeve? The only thing I can think of is, if you were going to have it so you could take it apart in the field, I guess the only obvious way to do it would be to thread it. Okay, threads. That's a whole other video. Threads, there's like 5 things about threads that are just the kiss of death. Threads and aluminum. If you've ever had a motorcycle and had to take it apart and get the screws out of the side case and stuff, you know, threads and aluminum is too soft for threads. Bottom line, if you thread it, and when you go to put it together, if the threads are really coarse, you'll have a better chance. Better yet, if they're coarse and flat top. But if on something this small, there just isn't enough material to go with a coarse thread. So your only alternative is a fine thread. Right off quick, fine threads in aluminum, if you ever cross-threaded it, and fine threads are notorious for cross-threading, it'd be very easy to damage a thread, and that would render the stove useless. You wouldn't be able to screw it or unscrew it. Second thing is, if you put it together and you tighten up a little bit too much, fine threads in aluminum, it could do what we call galling. That's when the metal from one surface tends to migrate over to the other surface. And the trouble with galling is if it starts to gall a little bit because you tighten it up too tight, when you start doing like this, trying to get it apart, every time you move it, it'll gall more. And it's a fishhook effect, where the more you go, the worse it gets. So threads in this body would just be a really, really bad idea. Anybody that's worked with aluminum, soft aluminum and threads knows it's, sometimes you don't have any other choice, but on quality things that do have threads in the aluminum, they use what's called a Healy coil. It's actually a stainless steel coil that's shaped like threads that taps and screws in and locks. So your other surface is running in stainless steel, not aluminum to aluminum. And quality things are made that way. Motorcycle side cases, cheap firearms, stuff like that will have aluminum threads with no Healy coil in them, but it's really not recommended. It's okay if it's something you're just going to put together once, but it's something that's going to be taken apart and put together over and over again. It's a really bad idea. Okay, enough of threads. Now, if I was going to make this and I didn't want to use silicone, there is a way around it. And to some degree I've done it with this base. If you make the stove body fairly airy, and when I say airy, if it's got a lot of thin surfaces on it, that they'll act like a heat sink. Like by milling this slot down the bottom down there, it's like a ½ inch deep. I've like tripled the surface area that heat can be carried off by the air. So if you have a stove with a fair amount of surface area to it, fairly airy base and as much thin area as possible, it will actually have enough heat sinks to carry the heat off and the alcohol won't boil. I thought about doing that, but I decided to go with the silicone because I wanted to be able to make the bottoms of my stoves fairly robust so they could support legs and things like that, thick in places. And it didn't lend itself well to heat sinks and to legs, so I made the base of like the M5. It's got a bunch of holes in it which act as a heat sink and lighten the stove up, but there's still a lot of metal in it, enough to support the legs. And without the thermal block silicone, it would overheat and boil the alcohol. I've tried it. For you guys, you stovies that have watched my videos on the early videos on the Voodoo when I was making them out of solid aluminum, that was the #1 problem. And the reason that I came up with the silicone was that they would boil the alcohol in the base. not good, and it would take right off and turn into a volcano and shoot flames up to here, and it wasn't very efficient. It would actually get so hot it would burn the wood underneath it if you had it setting on a wooden surface, like a soda can stove. So that's the reason why I use the silicone. It's a thermal block, and it's a very good way to connect and unconnect different parts of your stove. It's you know, like a dream. It's a thermal block, and it's a good connecting surface, and it's simple. It's easy, and in the history of mini bowl design, I don't believe there's ever been anybody have one of these silicone bodies ever fail. They're just too thick, too much silicone, and they just don't get enough heat. So, I beat my gums enough. I'm Tinny from Mini Bowl Design. Get out and hike, take a friend, enjoy the great outdoors, and more important than anything, try to have a really great day. Bye-bye.